Hey guys, I'm Josh, and today we're going to be talking about the Schiit Jotunheim, a fully balanced amplifier from a company called Schiit. I want to thank Schiit Review for sending this out for not only a review, but he's allowed me to borrow. I'm kind of currently loosely in the process of kind of passing the NFB on so I can get something new, but I want to review that first. Anyways, that part's not important. So he sent this over for review. And before we get into this, if you want to skip to any particular part of the review, go ahead and go over here, and that will get you to wherever you're trying to get. Now, real quick, a big part of amplifier reviews is having sort of, where do they stand in the market? What other things are out there that maybe sound better or worse? Now, I actually have a full comparison video, kind of a balanced amplifier roundup with the Mjolnir 2, the 1 amp, the Jotunheim here, and the Socris 1541. There's a link to that video down below if you're curious how it stacks up against other balanced amplifiers. I'm going to be comparing it a little bit against another amplifier for the balanced output, being the THX 789, which is about the same price range as this in the raw amplifier form. And for the single-ended output, I'm actually going to compare it to a much cheaper amplifier, the Monoprice Liquid Spark. And because I usually get a lot of questions and I usually forget to mention it in reviews, the headphones that I tested out of this consist of the LCD4, the HG800, the Focal Utopia, the HG1000 V2, and the DT1990 for the single-ended testing. The build is super impressive. This thing weighs about 4 pounds by feel, probably about 4 pounds. I'll put the exact weight up here. I'm not sure how exactly heavy this would be without the DAC module, probably just about the same weight. And for this review, I'm actually going to be talking about this without the DAC in it. This does have a balanced DAC in it. That is an option that you can get, but for consistency of using the same DAC in all of my amplifier reviews, I'm not going to be talking about the DAC that's input in this. It's an okay all-in-one little package, I think. It's a little pricey though, compared to some alternative kind of amplifier DAC combinations that I might look towards. So in the back, we have a power input, power switch, nice toggle, RCA and XLR pre-outs, which are adjusted by the volume, but they do not switch off at all. You can't turn those off, which is a little bit unfortunate. And then single-ended RCA and balanced XLR right and left inputs. Then on the front, we have your input selection. You can switch between RCA, XLR, and your DAC if you have one built in. You have a high-low gain. Also, both of these are toggles. You have your volume knob, single-ended 1/4-inch headphone output, and a balanced headphone output. Now, looks are going to be super subjective. I like the look of this. You may not, but I think that kind of more construction-y, kind of highly metallic look, I really dig the look of it. And the build of it was actually really impressive. When I first picked it up, I was kind of shocked at how heavy it was, because actually a lot of the higher-end Schiit products are really, really solidly built, that one included. Okay, so for the power output of this at 32 ohms, out of the balanced output, it puts out about 5 watts per channel. And out of the single-ended output at 32 ohms, it puts out about 1.5 watts. That's not a whole lot for a single-ended output. That's plenty of power on the balanced side. But if you, I'm gonna say this straight up right now, just so you know, if you want a better single-ended headphone amplifier, and you're gonna be running single-ended most of the time, or you running single-ended ideally all the time for this specific circumstance that I'm going to talk about, you're better off with something like that Monoprice Liquid Spark that I was talking about. It sounds better than the single-ended out of this thing. It's not very impressive. So this is definitely going to be a headphone amp that you're going to look at if you're running balanced. I think that's fairly obvious to say, but I want to make it very clear for those of you who are curious about the single-ended performance, it's not great. We're not going to talk about that today, though. We're going to talk about what it's made for, which is a balanced in, balanced out headphone amp. Sound quality of this I would describe as being overall slightly V-shaped. I wouldn't necessarily call it a dip in the mid-range as much as just a raise in the bass and the treble, and I'll get more into that in a second. Now, you're also going to be hearing some pretty noticeable compression on this amplifier. Now, that's not inherently a bad thing. There are a few examples I'll talk about later where that's actually a good thing, but that is the general sound signature that you're going to get with this. Slight compression, slight V-shape. Those are the main focusing points. Separation is decent. It's not class leading, not spectacular in any way, but not poor or muddy in that area either. So comparatively to the THX 789, which is actually, of the amplifiers that I've sat and tested, it's probably the best one so far. So I'm going to compare it a little bit against that because they're competing price ranges. They're both, balanced headphone amplifiers. For the sake of that, I'm going to consider that a neutral headphone amplifier. So what is this doing compared to that perfect reference point, so to speak. Perfect, right? So the Jotunheim has a slight dip in resolution in the high end that is also coupled with a little bit of a boost in the brightness of those highs. So it brings the highs up a tad bit, but then it also loses resolution in that process. So for certain headphones like the Utopia or the HD800 or some of the AKG offerings that are, to my ear at least, brighter headphones, it's not really going to do them any favors. One, you're going to be dealing with that lack of resolution, and two, you're going to be feeling that effects of like the raising of that brightness. Mid-range is not necessarily, even though we're talking about V-shaped, it's not that the mid-range is dipped down any, it's more just that the treble and the bass response are brought up, and that kind of creates that V-shaped sound signature that I'm talking about. Now, when I'm talking about a boost in the treble and a boost in the bass, I'm really talking in very small amounts. Like, it's not something that you listen to and you're like, whoa, this is crazy or anything like that. It's not like that. It's very subtle. If I were to put an arbitrary visualizable number, I would say 2 to 3% boost in the treble and the bass response. Not really an exacting thing, but that's just kind of my perception of like, okay, it's a little bit brighter, it's a little bit bassier. Okay, now the bass response of this is actually boosted a little bit. Like I said, we're talking about that V-shaped sound signature. It's boosted a little bit. Now, it's not boosted because of some inherent kind of more power in that area. It's not like that. What it more is that it actually has less control over the low end, resulting in a looser but larger sounding bass response. It's not as tight, it's not as refined, but it is a little bit more in amount, or at least perceived amount, from my perspective at least. Okay, so we've basically broken down the general sound signature. Where would I recommend the THX and where would I recommend the Jotunheim? Because those are kind of the two mainly competing headphone amps in this price range. You're probably wondering when to get which one. So I would describe it like this. The THX is going to benefit headphones that you think are already pretty much as good as you want them to sound. Sound signatures that you really enjoy, you don't have any flaws with. The THX is really going to highlight all the benefits of that headphone and sometimes highlight some of the drawbacks of that headphone, but in general, you're only going to see positive results from going to the THX, and it's going to be a much cleaner interpretation of the music. So if you're listening to something like the HD600 line or the LCD line or the myriad of headphones that sound great as they already do, the THX is really going to benefit those. So that's the safe bet. If you want something a little bit more nuanced, if you want something a little bit riskier, and that does affect the sound in a little bit more of an influential way, for better or for worse, I would look at the Jotunheim. This is going to benefit headphones. Well, for me specifically, I like the Alex with it. The Alex is a super resolving headphone to begin with. It has a ton of resolution, but the dynamics for me, while great for technicality, are a little bit much in terms of enjoyment. They're a little bit too, it's a little bit too loud of a headphone, if that makes any sense. And because of that compressed dynamic factor that the Jotunheim has, the Jotunheim actually made the Alex more enjoyable, and I was able to deal with the slight boost in the bass response and the lack of resolution in the highs. Because it's already such a resolving headphone, I didn't really feel like I was missing much in that area. And for the pairing of that amp and that headphone, I felt like the benefits outweighed the compromises. Another headphone or series of headphones that would probably benefit from the Jotunheim are going to be like the LCD series. And the reason why is because they have such great control of the bass response already that even when you're adding a slightly looser signal to it, it still has really solid bass performance. And because LCDs usually, not everyone, but usually are a little bit thin in the treble department, that boost in treble does a really great job. I'm thinking maybe not the higher end ones. I think like the LCD4, for example, I really wanted a resolving amplifier. But something like the 2C would be great with the Jotunheim. And I also want to point out, I think there's a lot of haters for Schiit, and I'm not really in the camp of the Schiit hating side. I do not think that they're the best or cleanest or most perfect amplifier out there by a long shot. In fact, there's a series of amplifiers before I would even consider them for that title. What I will say is that while the sound signature is not perfect, it is different, and you may be looking for different. This is not necessarily the path that I recommend taking, but it is a path that I wouldn't steer somebody away from if they were interested or curious about the Jotunheim amplifier. It's not a bad amplifier. It's not as good as some others that I personally would recommend. I think there are some better options. There are some worse options. This is kind of a great middle of the road If you really like build quality, if you like a slightly boosted signature, if you want slightly boosted high end, this might be worth looking into. If you want something super clean, I would go with, if you're looking for single-ended, the Liquid Spark. Decent amount of power, about, I think it was 2-ish watts at 50 ohms. Don't quote me on that, I'm just pulling it from memory. And that's gonna be for the single-ended stuff. And then if you're into balance, I, again, recommend the THX 789. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. A huge shout out to Z again. Thank you for sending these out for review. So link to his little subscription area down below. All right, guys, thanks very much for watching. I'm Josh, signing off.